right, welcome to the next installment of the City Builders podcast. We are here to talk about cities once again, the city builders. And today our topic is on the historic city, or the city that has great historical bones, and how we see cities like that have those elements, how they move into the future. How do we address city building or architecture, urban design, planning, how we address those aspects of the city moving forward.
And why that's important. It's one thing to say that we want to transition from the city of the past through to the future, but why in general is that important? And I think part of it is the respect for history, which I think we need to have, which does not always exist in a lot of our centers. I mean, we've had a long history, pun not intended, of ignoring things in the past or wanting to start anew, wipe the slate clean, get rid of the constraints of history. But I think what we see is that history is a major component of just about every successful city that we've been to.
It's funny when I think about the value of history in a city, or the value of architecture and I guess streets, neighborhoods, districts that have a historical component. Think about the different periods over the last 100 years that we've gone through where they've been important, or history or historical structures or preservation has been important, and at times where it hasn't been important. It's been actually considered older buildings, let's get rid of them, they're in the way, they're no good, what have you. And it's interesting when you go back in history and study beyond our time. Obviously, we've been practicing for a long time, so we've seen a little bit of this ebb and flow ourselves. But also when you read books about the thinking, I'm going back to Jane Jacobs in the 60s and prior to that in the 50s, right after the war, when redevelopment was really a big deal. Everyone was sort of pushing for new and better and all that. But you can even go back into the 20s with Corbusier and the rethinking of Paris and places like that. I mean, there's really a long history of whether or not historical elements of a city should be preserved, or whether they're old school and they should just be discarded. And I think that ebb and flows happen, and sometimes it's happened at the detriment of historic buildings, and that sometimes it's happened where you've had people intervene and save historic properties in the face of demands to get rid of, hence Jane Jacobs. Right. And then where do we go with that?
One of the things to think about, and I don't understand why it's such a problem. If you think about all of the let's take it from the scale of just the building to the scale of the neighborhood. When you think about all the neighborhoods in North America, let's just confine it to North America, that have the most value, they're all the historic neighborhoods.
For the most part,
whether you're in Boston, whether you're in New York, whether you're in Detroit, whether you're in San Francisco. It's all the areas that have a historical basis, that have all the value, monetary value, but also emotional,
property value
and emotional value.
Yeah, high demand.
Yeah, and we both live in historic communities, and we understand that value. And yet it still seems to be not a general consensus, which I find very intriguing.
Yeah, that's clearly an interesting aspect of it, where the reality is, as you say, there's a lot of different examples where some of what would be considered the most valuable places are these places that have historical connections going back, so many years. But so many people at the same time like new, right? Oh, we like it new. We like this new. We want a brand new house, or brand new this, or brand new that. And so there is a really interesting kind of, on the surface, it seems that there's a lot of interest in something new. And yet at the same time, what we found is what has really risen to be the most prominent, valuable places, sought after, and as our friend Jim Kunstler likes to say, places worth caring about, and it's one of his great lines. Those places really rise above in most cities, and yet so many people want new stuff.
Well, you gotta question what they really mean by new. Do they mean they want new construction, or do they mean they want the way new construction functions? And is there an opportunity for adaptive reuse and renovation to sort of solve those kinds of problems? Because what we're seeing, as most urbanists know, is that walkability is top of mind everywhere today. And, that's not necessarily always related to newer areas or newer developments. Usually, existing areas are usually the ones that we talk about when we talk about walkability.
Yeah, well, that goes back to, I guess, one of the things I wanted to point out, just for clarity's sake, I guess, when we talk about historic bones or older communities, I guess we need to clarify what that means.
Right.
And as we know, it's all the elements that we see as really fundamental to the ingredients of these places,
Right.
the street grid, the block pattern or the size of a city block, the particular architecture, which you could get into scale and materials and all that, the landscape, trees, how many trees, how big are the trees, where are they placed, all these things. And then you get into other elements like the incorporation of natural elements like a river or any kind of park situation or topographical changes, a hill, or what have you. And then I guess additional to that is cultural assets. There are civic buildings, schools, churches, all these kinds of things that make up sort of the overall nature of a community, and of course, not to mention additionally the commercial components, where there are shops and places like that. These are all the things that I guess when we talk about the bones, these are the things that we're talking about. How they're placed and how they're designed and how they're incorporated are really contributing to what makes that overall experience.
Yeah, it's the traditional city.
Yeah, traditional city.
And when we say
neighborhood and or downtown or whatever.
Yeah, and when we say that, we mean this traditional city from a structural standpoint, not necessarily an aesthetic standpoint, because you have some cities, and we were just talking a little while ago about the city of Toronto, where they have the bones or the underlying urban grid that helps organize the urbanity of that place, but they've demolished a lot of their historic architecture and replaced it, but there's still an urban character there that, because the infrastructure or the bones were in place, it still persists.
Yeah, so the street grid is the same as it's been for 100 years, 150 years, wherever you want to start that in. The street grid, the block pattern, the densities, a lot of those things are still there. Many of the historic buildings aren't there. And so when we talk about, traditional, like you said, from a standpoint, it doesn't necessarily mean historical. It doesn't necessarily have to mean that, buildings have arches and they're made out of brick from 1820. You can have a brand new building that actually fits into what would be the traditional urban pattern in that regard. And I think that's really important to recognize, that you can have older buildings, historic buildings, even preserved historic buildings and adaptive reuse historic buildings integrated with brand new buildings, ground up, new infill development, and still have the collective experience a positive for the people that live and work and play in these places. And that I think there's oftentimes confusion about that.
Right. And I think, when we were listing off those components, one of the things that I don't think we talked about yet is the public space. And that's, green space, squares, open space, and the space of the street itself as an important component for organizing these urban areas and making them successful. So that, the most successful places have a combination of an ample amount of public space as well as the connectivity of those public spaces. I'm thinking like Savannah when we were there, and it's in all of its connected squares as a very basic primary example. But it's this balance between the neighborhood, the city, the public space, and the connectivity that I think is important for the topic that we're doing now, which is taking the city into the future.
Yeah, and I guess the other term that comes out in our dialogue about this kind of thing over the years is the idea of character, the character of a
Mhm.
city. What is the character of the city? What makes up, the distinction of that? And we're big fans of the whole idea of regional, locals, vernacular, something that identifies one city over another, so that Detroit doesn't necessarily feel like Buffalo and doesn't feel like Indianapolis, and it's different than Dallas or Atlanta or Savannah.
Mhm.
And what are those characteristics? How do you feel like you're in one city over another, as opposed to cities being kind of generic or being sort of the same where you don't have a distinction. And that's another thing is these bones, and a lot of them are the historic things that go back,
Mhm.
whether it's any number of these particular elements, this, the grid, the block, what have you, but also the architecture, the materials, the
Mhm.
scale, sometimes the landscape. All of those things make up for you understanding that you were in one place over another. And then the idea of, when we do city building, the idea that you build upon
Mhm.
that you actually recognize the context as it is distinctive to that place. And when you intervene or add more to it, you're adding to it to build upon the bones that are there. You build upon the character that's there to move it forward and strengthen it, not to sort of negate it or to hurt it or to create something that's generic and not
Right.
necessarily defined there.
What you bring up is something that we both were trained on. I mean, that's regionalism and vernacular understanding. The character of a place aesthetically, but also functionally. And I think that's something that's been lost. Over the last few decades, is understanding that each place has a specific way that it works, along with a specific way that it looks, and that can be built upon. And I just want to make sure people understand we're not talking about copying. We're talking about creating a synthesis between what you build new and what's already existed, and that takes a lot of, I was about to say skill and talent, but it really takes more. It takes a lot of dedication from design professionals, whether it's planning, urban design, or architecture.
Well, it's also awareness. This idea that we're advocates of sort of analyzing the condition of the project or the place that we're working on, whether it's a master plan or whether it's a building project or a specific site development, what have you. That this idea of analyzing the overall site and recognizing what's there and what are these components
Mhm.
that make it unique, and then start to apply those to the redevelopment. So it's built upon the awareness and observations of what's there, the perspective of what makes it unique to be in that city, in that place, and then it builds upon that. So when we talk about all of these, let's talk a little bit about a couple of cities specifically. Detroit, we mentioned Toronto, and maybe a couple of others. Is this idea that as these cities have grown over the course of many, many decades, in some cases centuries. I
Mhm.
mean, a lot of people don't realize how old some of these cities are. I mean, we have cities in America, which is mostly where we work and where we are, or North America, I should
Mhm.
say, is that these cities are 200, 300 years old. Detroit
Right.
is over 300 years old.
Mhm.
The 300 over 320 years old now.
Yeah.
And so what has evolved over those many, many, many years in many of these cities that still allow them to be relevant today,
Mhm.
in a current day circumstance, that they actually function. To your point about functioning, not only aesthetics and character, but it has to function. But how have they evolved to remain a place that's distinctively Detroit or Toronto or Cleveland or whoever, with the elements that were there for many, many years. Many cases maybe have been lost. Some cases they've decayed and turned into abandoned structures. And then now we're seeing, where they're at now. How does Cleveland feel like Cleveland
I was
from 1910?
right. I was just about to say that from our recent travel and study of Pittsburgh and Cleveland, how there are similarities between those two cities, and even similarities between them and a city like Detroit. But when you really start to look at it, and you can see how the heritage of each of the cities, even though they're each this sort of, Midwest or semi-Midwestern industrial city, Detroit's industrial nature is more manufacturing, where the other two have more of a port-oriented industry, and so there are different things or different factors that affect each of those cities and make them look and feel very different from a city like Detroit or a city like Chicago, which has a whole other amount of issues that define its character.
And some of that is it's periods of growth
when they
were developing, when they were prominent, or when they were developing at a higher level versus a lesser level, and that ebbs and flows as well. And a number of other things, like you said, when you talk about ports, obviously all these cities that we're talking about, most cities, frankly, are on water of some sort. That's usually why they're located where they are, because historically water was the accessibility of the past. But Detroit being on a river, being on a narrower river across from Windsor, across from Canada, is a very different character than being on a lake, which is, of course, in the case of Chicago and also Cleveland, as you mentioned. But then you have the unique characteristic of Pittsburgh being on multiple rivers and within this sort of valley, mountainous kind of, very topographically unique circumstance. So all of those things, including the development initiatives, that they really kind of factor in. But I want to get back to that point about these periods of what were the growth mechanisms in those different cities, whether it be manufacturing or commerce or any number of more water oriented, in some cases more in some cases it's train oriented or any number of things. And getting back to Detroit, one of the things we've noticed over the years, and having both, obviously both of us growing up in Detroit, born in the city, and grown up here, and as we started studying the city over the years, really recognizing the unique architectural value that a city like Detroit has. And there are a number of cities, and we were in Pittsburgh recently, we were amazed at all the great architecture that was there.
Yeah, incredible.
And incredible amounts of historic architecture, a lot of it very well intact in many cases, in most cases, and really created a character that was really very different than I think a lot of cities, actually more East Coast than more of a Midwest feel. But going back to Detroit, one of the things we've recognized over the years is that now in our current day, we look out to all these incredible pieces of architecture that are here, and we think, wow, this city has gone through a lot of challenges and a lot of ups and downs, but we still have an incredible amount of great architecture, great civic architecture, great vertical skyscrapers, some of the best architecture, historic skyscrapers in the world, and all kinds of really unique civic buildings like the DIA, Detroit Institute of Arts, or Orchestra Hall, or the Detroit Yacht Club. I mean, just incredible amounts of architecture. And we think, wow, how does this city have so much? And in its troubled times, how did it actually not lose it all? And
we lost we did lose quite a bit in those times. But I think as we talked about before, one of the things that happened is that we also went through a period where other cities were ripping things down and building, less than desirable contemporary structures. That's a politically correct way of saying it.
Nice,
doing that, where in Detroit we were spared of that just because of
some degree.
To some degree,
we definitely lost our share and had plenty of things that were built not so great. But.
Some not so great, but not as bad as some other cities that we visited. And so in that respect, it was, the lack of economic activity was somewhat of a blessing now, looking back at it, because we've been able to preserve and not harm, our environment.
Yeah, it's interesting because we spent a lot of our time in Toronto as well, And we see in a place like Toronto where there was a significant amount of demolition
Yes.
done by some really great architecture that was there 100 years ago. And you see pictures of Toronto before and that, before and after, or now and then, and what have you. And the lack of historic elements in a place like Toronto is evident. And like you said, I think the interesting thing is that Detroit had a lot of demolition, but also had a lot of buildings that really, there wasn't enough value to tear them down for the parking lot that you would get out of it.
Right.
And there wasn't a need for another building to tear it down to build a new building. So what do you have? We had a lot of buildings that were empty for a long time. And I think, when we say a long time, we have to be clear.
Right.
30 years,
years.
35 years, 40 years.
Right.
I mean, we had buildings sitting around in the city of downtown and midtown and such that some of the cases that we worked on, projects that we worked on, were 30 years old, like the Vinton building, just across the street from our office here. The idea that these buildings sat empty for many, many years. Some cases they had trees growing out of their roofs.
Right.
20 stories in the air, you'd have a number of trees that would grow. And you're like, what's going on up on that roof? And like, well, that's just because it's been sitting there for 28 years, and there, some seedling landed there at some point, and now it's a 10-foot tree, and that's the kind of thing that we dealt with. But the building was still there.
Right. But
and now what do we say?
Yeah. The key question is, what do we do? Because we can't use that as a development strategy moving forward.
Let's hope not. Yeah.
Right.
No, I think it's just a matter of recognizing the circumstance that we actually now see as, in a sense, a hidden blessing.
Right.
As much as it was terrible to watch for many years, these buildings sitting empty. But they now, you look back at things as those buildings are now all getting renovated. All of those buildings, for the most part, short of a few that we lost, most of those are now active or on the way to be fully active development, including the Grand Train Station, which has been empty for so long that people thought it would never turn around. And yet it's 3/4 of the way through of being fully renovated.
But the key question is, you talked about the ebbs and flow. I just wonder how long we're going to be on the ebb and how long we're going to be on the flow. Meaning,
isn't that always the question?
Yeah, well, that is the question, but it's kind of a scary question. If attitudes start to change, and right now we can't foresee that, but we couldn't understand, why people demolished the buildings in the past that they did, and so the key question is, what kinds of things can we put in place now to make the city transitional, as opposed to kind of a stop-start situation where we're always starting over, whether it's new buildings, renovations, or what have you.
Well, I think it's an important question, but I think the nature of city development is this idea that it gets hot at times, and then it gets cold. And that's true in really any city, because that's the nature of city developments. Are connected to the economy, and they're connected to prosperity, and they don't continue on unless you're Toronto, of course. Very rare cities will just continue to go and go and go, no matter what seems to happen in the economy. But many of these cities, they have a boom and a bust cycle.
But that's my point.
And it's difficult, I think, it's a good thing as a goal, but frankly, the economy, dictates whether developments are going to happen or not.
But I guess where I'm going with it is, how can we put things in place, things even as simple as form-based codes that can help to guide how the city should, or how it wants to be developed over time. I know things will start and stop. We have development.
But you have the
ways.
Foundation of the codes and the ordinances and the master plans that guide development, whether it's a bust or a boom,
and the
cycle.
Leadership and grassroots that support it. Yeah. I think that's the key.
So when things don't go so well, and we're on a lower part of the bust and boom cycle, that you don't result to drastic measures to start clearing house for some reason, because it happens to be the easiest thing to do given the circumstances,
or the in thing to do,
or the end thing to do. we've always recognized that Detroit boomed at some really good times.
Right.
We boomed. I mean, the three big times that I know that I think we boomed greatly. Of course, in the late 1800s, 1870, 1880, with what was the lumber industry, which was huge and creating a lot of wealth in the area. That boom brought us a lot of great architecture and urbanism that is still around today. Yep. And then we had the great boom of the teens and 20s in 1910 to 1930, which was, of course, the initial automotive boom, which created an incredible amount of wealth and phenomenal buildings like the one we're in now from 1909, and the Guardian building across the street, 1927, or the Penobscot building. Incredible amounts of buildings and architecture that was done at that time, that were completed at that time, that we still have today and that are great places to be in. And then the boom just after the war that really, in many cases, what we always consider to be that really special early modern architecture that came out of that initial post-war period, 1945 to 1955 or so. Right. The city boomed dramatically during that time, and that was another example. And we have a lot of remnants from that as well that are terrific buildings
that whole Art Moderne period, Art Deco-ish period.
Yeah, and when you look at certain other cities, and I think of Dallas and Houston and Denver and other cities, that they boomed at times where they boomed greatly in the 80s. They boomed in many cases, a lot of those cities, because of the oil industry and such, the 80s or the 90s. And many of those periods of urban development weren't very pedestrian oriented. They weren't really urban from the standpoint of mixed use and urban and walkable. And a lot of the buildings that were done at that time were more iconic buildings set back from the street with plazas and things like that. Now the remnants are, a lot of those buildings are looking at retrofitting to find ways to become more people-oriented, more pedestrian-oriented, to fill in some of those plazas and to articulate the street level, the edges. So it's a very interesting, I guess, analysis of cities growing over time with character, sometimes based on history, sometimes based on boom and bust, but altogether that create, very different and interesting places. And of course, our goal always is to see all of these different cities become better places for people.
Right. And I'm sure, as our audience probably could tell, we could speak on this all day. But I think we're about to close this podcast out. It's been a very interesting discussion. It spurred some other thoughts that we'll pick up in some additional podcasts in the future.
A lot of interesting points here, and plenty more to where that comes from. So with that, we're going to wrap up, and we'll see you next time at the City Builders podcast. And as we always say,
walk the streets.
Very good.